We are looking at the weekend of Prof. Mangaliso Sobukwe and Mrs. Zondeki Sobukwe. We're starting today, which is the 2nd of December, up until the 5th of December. There are sessions that will be happening. Announcements will be made at the end of the session. Today, we are looking at the African personality. That will be explained by Mr. Sibusiso Xaba, Mr. Masixole Mlandu, and Sister Mohau Pheko. They will just unpack to us what is an African personality. I will then hand over to Mr. Sibusiso Xaba, who will take us through his presentation for the next 10 minutes. And then after that, I will hand over to Masixole Mlandu. Then after that, it will be Sister Ausi Pheko. Then we will then have questions and then closing remarks. Over to you, Mr. Xaba. Can we kindly switch off our videos if we are not presenting and put ourselves on mute? Over to you, Mr. Xaba.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just have sound issues on my side. I hope that, Chair, you have requested me to go ahead. Can I get a signal?
You can go ahead.
Thank you very much. The topic that we are touching today, it's a topic of high interest because it talks of us as a people. How do we respond the way that we respond to the things that we respond to? Firstly, I would like to highlight that the issues of personality comes quite nicely out of the biblical text. If you look at the way that Paul normally talks to the church, he emphasized on the different personalities. That's why you will see his letters to various churches or to various areas. When it talks to the Romans, it talks the same message, but he portrays it differently to the way that he portrays it to to the Ephesians or any other people. That highlights to the importance of a personality. There is quite two close definition, a person and a personality. Personality in law talks to performance, and personality in psychology talks to characteristics. So when you put the two together, then it tells you that the characteristics, more strictly the behaviors, takes people to how they behave, how they receive the message, or how they receive the gospel, or how they receive their politics, how they receive everything that comes to them. They filter it through this filter of character and performance. So what is a personality in general? A personality is basically what makes you behave like you are behaving when you are not conscious. So it's embedded in your subconscious. Personality is ingrained by a number of things. One, things that emanates from internal, which will then talks to your beliefs, talks to what has been ingrained by your culture, and manifests itself in your typical routinely behavior. That's come from inside. Therefore, it talks to your mental as well, to the cognitive element of you. That's why, as I say, that when you look at Paul speaking to the church, you'll see him talking about the renewal of the mind, because your belief in conflict with your emotions, which are your feelings, then create a problem to the personality. And then it manifests how the individual person behaves. But the interesting part about the personality is that it's not limited to you. It's not limited to the internal. It also talks to the external environment, the biological factors that then you'll see why biblically it's said that what you are doing now as a person will manifest in the third and the fourth generation. Although it only talks about punishment, but so are the good behavior. The behaviors that you manifest today are affected by the biological makeup of what you've gone through multi-generational. So personality is a result not just of one generation of you as an existence, but how your biologically has been taken care of. Hence, the good book teaches us that we must look at our bodies as the temple of God, because it does the work of God in terms of the creation to the new generations. It also talks to environmental issues, the quality of the air you breathe, the cleanliness or dirtiness of the environment that you are in, the radiation in your environment. All those issues end up manifesting into a personality. So that's how the personality is created. What is unique about the African personality? It's basically those external factors that created internal factors throughout our history. We have a 500-year history of total brutality. We've got a further 500 years history of moving beyond the Sahara, because the empires that we had built as a people were under attack in what now it's called Sudan, and what now it's called Egypt, and the whole north. As we were moving downwards, we have different experiences. You'll say that we all did not move down. Historically, there are people who've been in the south for long. However, the exchange of our genetical makeup is made of all those things that we went through. Therefore, it creates uniqueness in terms of how do we manifest our behavior, and how do we take care of our interests as a people. So when you see African people not knowing their interests or not behaving in the manner that serve their interests, you must have an appreciation of the history, because personality being crafted by the internal and the external. The external, your enemy can then manipulate your external environment to produce a particular personality. So that's a challenge that as African people, we consistently have to fight with to change our environment. It's not by mistakes that in Azania, what is called South Africa, we are kept in squatter camps so that you can be staffed, your mind can operate from a perspective of scarcity. It's intentional, because those who benefit from our personality not being centered in the right place, where it should be, in the godly place, are intentionally driving. It's not a mistake that Verwoerd opened alcohol in townships when other people were saying that African must not enjoy alcohol. because substance abuse affects your biology, and he had a particular intention to shape it in a particular manner. So as African people, it becomes perfect, or it becomes a conscious and political, what we eat, where we live, what we smell, where we work, so that we can maintain a good personality. You want a personality that is balanced. I must say there is no good personality or bad personality. As I close, Chair, the only personality that is good for you, it's an appropriate personality. You will see the Europeans pushing and redefining African personality around Ubuntu. You'll ask yourself, why haven't they adopted Ubuntu if Ubuntu as a concept was such perfect? But for them, you'll see taking this Ubuntu, which looks very good on paper, but using so that we become subservient to them extracting resources without us resisting. Because now emphasis on Ubuntu is not our interest as people, but is the interest of looking after foreigners, making sure that foreigners who arrive at your land are catered and you give them land. Those kind of issues that are good at high value, but at some stage do not serve us as a people, changes the environment externally, then leave us out of harmony with our godly position that is suitable for us. Let me stop the chair and give back to you and the panel. Thank you.
Over to you, Masixole, just to continue from where Babu Xaba stopped from, if just to add your inputs from your side.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if you can hear me, Chair. Just an indication that you can hear me and I'm audible.
You are audible and we can hear you.
Okay, no, thank you. It's always difficult to speak after the chairperson of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania per protocol, because we walk on shoulders of giants, and Xaba is one of those comrades who, in the movement, we have always learned from. So I don't know how I should take this gesture, program director, whether it is deliberate or sabotage, but I shall take it as it is. I wanted to first thank you all for the opportunity to dialogue on what I think is very crucial when we consider the ways in which African lives and African people are situated today. To ask very important questions, whether, firstly, what is an African personality in a world in which Africans have no power, authority, or a sense of land or a sense of belonging? What do questions of subjectivity or questions of identity actually mean for a people whose life is constantly at nervous conditions? To a question whether is there an African personality to even begin with? Again, building on top of the very same question that I asked for a people whose life has been disrupted, who are dwelling in townships, who are dwelling on villages, who are dwelling on very diabolical conditions. Can we say that there exists an African personality? And if that African personality does not exist, what kind of a framework could we adopt, learning from Sobukwe philosophy of African nationalism at the core? So I think, Chair, I will try to attempt to move around those things. And perhaps the last thing that I would attempt to do is to perhaps try and squeeze in Albert Camus' work on the rebel. The idea that perhaps I'm even thinking far now, perhaps an African personality should be a personality that is able to say no and say yes at the same time, and saying no to oppression and saying no to the continuous dehumanization and the plunder of the continent at the expense of the Western world, and saying yes to freedom, and saying yes to African nationalism as the guiding creed to our liberation, but also saying yes to the fact that our struggles in the south of the continent in Azania are not unique or different from the collective struggles that have been faced by other people. But let me just go back to my initial so that I don't lose the plot. The idea that we must ask whether is it possible to have an African personality in a world in which Africans, particularly here in occupied Azania, have no land or have no power base and have no sense of ownership and authority around their lives. What kind of a personality, what kind of an attitude of Africans should they take in a moment where they find themselves in those conditions? I argue that though we might have a historical memory over or bits and pieces over who we used to be and what we have achieved in the past, but the moment of colonialism, as Comrade Xaba has mentioned, and slavery, and subsequently all forms of other processes and events that have led to the African continent, has totally disrupted the African ways of living, but also the African ways of feeling and thinking and behaving. And this is this rupture that I argue that gives us no other choice but to reconsider what could be an African personality. And I think if we are to reconsider what is an African personality, we must first depart from the position that our lives and our ways of being and our ways of seeing were totally disrupted in ways in which cannot be mended in the same way in which we used to live. So we're stuck in some kind of way into that event, into that moment that became to shape our reality in a new, different way. Today, we find ourselves with disrupted or disorganized families. Today, we find ourselves with high numbers of young Black boys in prison. Today, we find ourselves in a high rate of teenage pregnancy. Today, we find ourselves in a high rate of alcohol abuse, with a high rate of death and a high rate of disease affecting the African people. And that on its own is a consequence or as a result of that particular disruption, the dispossession of land, the forcing of Africans to sell their labor, the disruption of African ways of doing and their culture, and more importantly, the disconnection of the African people to their language. Most of the young breeds that we are raising today are no longer able to speak an African language fluently, and maybe precisely because there is no sense of community besides the community of the oppressed. So I think first and foremost, an African personality must first recognize this. If there's no such thing as an African personality, I enter into my second point. If there's no such thing as an African personality, what could be a framework in which we think about the possibility of an African personality? What would that African personality look like? And I think I'm tempted to borrow from Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe on his teaching in Pan-Africanism and in African nationalism as a guiding field of our liberation. One thing that Sobukwe perhaps teaches us in Oceania is the fact that what we experience on the southern part of the continent is not necessarily unique or different. It might have its own particular conditions and its own specificities, but it does not necessarily mean that it is not an experience that has been endured or been part and parcel of the broader continent. So an African personality must have an attitude that is cognizant of the fact that South Africa's problem or Azanian problems cannot be fixed outside of the problems of the continent. And the problems of the continent are nothing but old age problems of colonialism, our relationship with the West, which has made us to be the rest in the expense of creating itself as the West. So an African personality must be cognizant to that particular historicity and to that particular experience in which Africans have endured. Two, that one thing that we also learn from Sobukwe and his guiding philosophy is the fact that the solutions and the problems of Africa can only be confronted using African categories of thinking and using African categories of meaning and feeling. And what do I mean by using the categories of African ways of thinking and meaning? It is precisely an understanding that categories that are borrowed from the West to analyze our problems can never be useful if we don't take into context our own specificities as an African continent. As an African continent, as a people, we're not in a stagnant position precisely because God has ordained us to be in this particular position. We are not less developed precisely because our land is not wealthy and our people cannot think. There is a particular relationship that one must have to understand that our wealth and our ways of thinking and our culture have been expropriated and have been taken forcefully in order to aid another country or another nation or another people. So for their survival means that our destruction must happen. For their success, it means our dismay must happen. For their triumph, it means that our downfall must happen. An African personality must be able to use the categories of thinking and meaning to understand that the land in Africa fundamentally belongs to the Africans, just like China belongs to the Chinese, just like Europe belongs to the Europeans. And if you go anywhere in the world, there's no contestation that China belongs to China or Europe belongs to Europe. But when you come here at home, we hear things that South Africa belongs to all of those who live in it, both black and white. And an African personality must be able to have cognizant of those kind of particular politics. And I want to enter into this framework. So the framework that an African personality must just be able to adopt is an understanding that first and foremost, South Africa and the greater part of the continent, particularly in South Africa, remains an unethical society who the secular and those who are conquered lived together, not in harmony, but in the most unequal and unfair redistribution of wealth in society. And this is what makes South Africa an unethical society. And these powers of relations can extend to all parts of the continent, which have shared even in themselves a particular history of secular colonialism. So an African personality, going back to Albert Camus, must be a personality that is able to say no to all of these things, but say yes to freedom. And yes to freedom, I borrow again to Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe when he purports that the African people, though Europe has produced science, man is able to walk in moon and travel back, the greatest contribution to ever come is yet to come from Africa. And that is to teach humanity a way to live more humane amongst each other. And that question in itself cannot come outside of the question of justice. So at the heart of the African personality is the question of justice to the historical and political and cultural wrongdoings that have been done to an African people, and to restore that which has long been lost. I said earlier on that I do not believe that we are able to go back to a time in which we were never disrupted. But I do believe that if we are going to come up with any framework of an African personality, we take the best from our past and we take the best from our experiences, even the West, and we fuse those experiences into a character that can combat any forms of colonialism, imperialism, capitalism manifesting in themselves, and usher a spirit of African nationalism, a spirit of Pan-Africanism, but more importantly, a spirit of a solidarity with all of those who are oppressed in the world. In those words, my Africa is related.
For your contribution on that. Unfortunately, we are having technical problems, and we are not able to get through to our sister Mohau Pheko, and we really apologize for that. And we just recently joined on the Wesley Guild SA Facebook, but on Twitter and other platforms it is available. I think in the meantime that we do not have any questions, I would probably, I think, go back to Sibusiso Xaba to actually give us an insight, because I had him, he was speaking about that when you look at African personality, you need to look at the cognitive psychology, which speaks to the feelings, and you also need to look at the emotional consciousness, which speaks to the thinking, and then there's also the behavioral consciousness, which goes to the thinking. But when you answer those questions in terms of how do we bring that, looking at the issue around what is an African personality, linking it with the African manifesto in terms of what is needed by us as Africans within Africa. And I want to also just add on that by borrowing from some reflections that are available, where they look at, I think it's an article which was written by Blasio Mambo, who was a lecturer in the systematic theology within the University of Zimbabwe, where he looks at the African personality, looking at the anthropological perspective for the leadership development that is needed in Africa, especially looking at what is happening within the context of our country around corruption, services not being brought to the people, and also a reflection onto the outcomes of what just recently happened within the elections, where Africans seem to have lost interest within the Liberation Party that had promised to give them the freedom. So it is just something that I would like you to touch on. In the meantime, I'm waiting for other questions.
Thank you very much, moderator. It is very important that we on this month of the birthday of Sobukwe when he was born on the 5th of December. It's very important that we look from the eyes of that generation. What did they have in mind as they were building the African, as they were building their posture on a new African personality? I'll re-emphasize the point that has been said, that we cannot be hopeful to go back. We are not about going back, but we're about going forward, to say beyond our disruption, what then happens. That's why from that perspective, the African Manifesto becomes a critical guide, because it always teaches us that as a nation, we must move away from operating from an antithesis point of view. So you say that the thesis is then becomes white supremacy as it stands now, which is the personality that we all have to conform to according to itself, due to its hegemony, versus the nationalistic perspective of Africa of the past, which asserts the African personality as in the center, and say that, can we find a synthesis? Can we move to a new consciousness that takes us a level higher than where white supremacy has created the problem? I think the new African personality, that's what we should look it for. However, I will really encourage our listeners and our viewers to look at a document called the PAC Disciplinary Code. That codes nicely to say what kind of a personality that we should be. In simple terms, without going to the document, it basically say read sufficient, read across, don't be ignorant. However, as you are reading, make up your mind of what is in your interest. So you don't read to memorize, you don't read to adopt, you read to create a new perspective. I think that's where the decolonization of curriculum comes very aggressively in terms of what we should do as African people to create and maintain a personality that serves Africa. That becomes critical, that what we are learning, we should have chosen for it to serve us. Because knowledge, as it comes from outside into you, it changes and refines your cognitive element, which is critical for your manifestation, which is then behavior. So the school as a program is designed to create a particular person. It's designed to create a African who's out of his personality, who serves white supremacy interest in the name of industrialization. Industrialization is not, or innovation is not equated to the white supremacy capital structure that exists currently. So it's very important, as we define in our head who we are as a collective and as we manifest ourselves. Secondly, the African Disciplinary Code then talks about how do we become calm, at the same time become assertive. It goes further and say, how do you then become assertive in your views, but still be able to be under authority of chairmanship, for example, in a meeting. So those if you see the African personality, if you ask what is the African personality, it represents an entity that is balanced, that does not go to any extreme. It does not seek to be fully law-abiding or not law-abiding, because laws can be unjust, because laws are created by people. It only has to conform to the natural laws that are given by our Creator. So that's a kind of personality you are looking at. And as an action, we need to really move to this element of decolonizing our lives, starting with decolonizing our education, decolonizing what we eat, decolonizing how we socialize, decolonizing our environment so that we can find ourselves in line with our interests. Interestingly, Chair, you highlight the issues of elections. It's interesting how our people assume that elections are a celebrity contest. They don't look at what each parties represent, then look at what is their interest. You find our people going to voting for a party that has expressed itself to be against their interest, to be against equity in this country, against redistribution of land, against anything that a nation will hold highly. It's because we have been conditioned. The 500 years or the 60 years of apartheid and the 500 years of other kinds of colonialism was conditioning us to move away from our interest. You will find those who represent the interest of other nations pumping money into some party and putting people who look like us, and we easily then get attracted to that. We're actually attracted to money, that money which works against our interest. So African personality has to center and align to African interest, away from the scenario which the manifesto puts in its section B, where you see foreigners taking away our people, taking away our land, then taking away our Africa, which is our personality, because we're now vulnerable. It becomes critical that we remove vulnerability, and vulnerability is only created by desire. The system just teaches your taste bud what is nice and what is not nice. If you detest what imprisons you and favor what liberates you, it will be easy for us to be liberated. Chair, in closing, I must say that as a Pan-Africanist organization, we are quite excited that we were able to double our size in these elections. We believe that the conscience of our people is moving. Our people are taking their interest more seriously, and they are looking at different options, and we remain as a critical option to the current environment that works against the African personality. Thank you, Chair.
I like it when you say that our taste buds, we must be careful of what interests our taste buds. If what interests our taste buds does not have the intentions of liberating us, then we should be careful about that. I can see that our big sister, or my big sister, Sister Mohau Pheko, has managed to join us. She has been having some technical issues. I'll see Pheko, Mohau, if you can put in your video, or if you don't mind, and if possible, there is any additional information that you can add, and also on the African personality, and also your understanding on what African personality is all about, and how we can look at it, understanding that we are looking at the week of Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, together with Umama Uzondeki, as we understand that on the 5th of December, Utatu Sobukwe was born. Over to you. I'll see you, Mohau, if over to you. I will unmute my side. Then you can just unmute, and then you can just give us your side and your presentation. And then after that, we will then take some questions. Over to you. Mrs. Mohau, are you able to go through? It looks like we're still having some challenges with our big sister. We really apologize for the technical glitches. I'm not sure if Masixole is still around, but I think what I would then pose to Masixole, understanding that he was part of the fees must fall and the roads must fall. In terms of what are the learning areas that you think made young people to be unified during fees must fall and roads must fall, and what kind of I think what was noticed by many people in South Africa was that there was a significant unit, let alone that there was some disconnection, but the unity that was shown by students, it was very, very important, and it shocked the entire country in terms of how students were united. And also, what is it that can be, what agenda can be done to ensure that we look at that? I always say, as someone who's a Methodist preacher, that we are blessed as the Methodist to have had Enoch Sontonga, who died at the age of 34 and left a legacy of Nkosi Sikelel Africa. We had Steve Biko, who was an Anglican that was very close to the late Reverend Kambela, who was called his political pastor in FEDSEM. And we also had Sobukwe, who was a local preacher within the Methodist Church. And all these were, when they started, they were below the age of 35. And Steve Biko actually died at the age of 30. And if you read his book, I Write What I Like, there is a time where he goes to Edendale and challenges the clergy around many things. And so that means that there is a potential for young people to play a role. And there is a young man in Cape Town, Lindo Kuhle Party, where we always call him the mayor of Cape Town, that we need him to be the mayor of Cape Town. So it's just a question that I would like. What is it that can be done to get young people to be involved in changing the landscape of our African personality and how we are perceived as the lost generation, whereas we come from, many come from fatherless generations and separated families, and also linking to the recent article that you had written around fatherhood. I think that will help us in the last 15 minutes that we have looking at the African personality.
Yeah, I think I was quite interested in the last points that you mentioned. The fact that all of these characters come from the church, and Mafukutando asked the question of what is the role of religion in supposedly in the construction of an African personality. And I think perhaps what, there are certain things we need to think about or understand about our situation. One being that we are stuck at this hole, and it's up to us how we use this hole to get out of it, or use it to further indoctrinate us. And now I'm reminded of even the way in which Some of the people that you have mentioned have sort of interpreted scripture. There is always a resemblance to scripture in ways in which they want to speak about the suffering that goes on throughout the narrative of Jesus Christ as a suffering that can never be amounted to the black suffering. So therefore, if God is a God of justice, is a God of love, therefore surely God is a God of black people. Because at the end of the day, no one has suffered and endured in life like the African subject has in the hands of other people who sit in the pulpit and pray to God to protect their wealth and pray to God to protect what they have ill-gotten from history and now. So I think that and that particular tension of always wanting to stretch, religion to its limit, it's very important in our scenario, precisely because many of our people are in church, because the church is able to answer certain basic questions that we as political parties have not been able to answer. What is the meaning of my existence in this world? What is the role that I am supposed to play? Who am I? Whether I'm destined to live in this earth, or is there another Havana that I'm supposed to go into? So religion can be used as a liberatory outlook, but the religion can be used as an oppression, and in ways in which we have experienced across the continent. So it's up to us at what condition and what time in our struggle are we willing to heighten the consciousness of our people, even in church. I know there's a kwilizwe elithi, do upon earth as it is in heaven. Yenza makube yenza njengasemhlabeni njengoba senziwe ezulwini. Yeah, I think so. Then we know that in heaven, people, in the house of God, people are living a very peaceful, prosperous life. But here, in the earth, we know that Africans are living in hell. So that's what I wanted to say. And on towards the question of religion, but on the question of students, part of what sort of also made students to be so united, I suspect, is the recognition of the condition or the plight of Black people or African people. And hence, I suspect that any form of African identity or African personality must be attentive to the living conditions. I'm trying to understand, for example, for a child who has grown up in a shack, what kind of message is that shack communicating to them every time they have to wake up in that shack? Is it not a message of incompleteness? Is it not a message of destitute? Is it not a message of feeling defeated as a human being? So in order to restore an African personality, we have to be attentive to the living condition, alter those living conditions in ways in which we no longer desire, that we no longer want, or does not serve our interest. But as I said, being attentive to the plight of our people made us to see ourselves as a group that has been historically and socially discriminated against as a collective, as Miko would say. And in that call, it gave us a language not to see our problems as unique to us only, but our problems dating back as early as white people started to land their ugly feet on our land. So there is a historical connection that sort of happened in a ways in which it's not really spoken. The fact that all Black people, from different class backgrounds were able to blend with each other in order to articulate a systematic problem, I think spoke to the fact that there is a yearning of feeling that we are together precisely of the shared common experience, because there's a particular encounter that as Africans we have with the world, and that encounter is only experienced by us. So when we meet in these different institutions, of higher learning, that particular encounter is invoked, you know, whether it's not recognizing yourself within the curriculum, or whether it's not recognizing ourselves within the walls of the university, or whether not recognizing ourselves within the composition of the staff and the teaching staff of the university, or even within the form of teaching, the student and the teacher format that seems to give authority to the teacher and gives an obedient or a lesser status to the student as a supposedly a learner. So the student movement, of course, was able to demonstrate its strength precisely because it sort of understood that the university is a microcosm of broader society. What we experience in the university tomorrow is what society is actually experiencing. The fact that our universities can happily glorify people who have plundered and killed and taken land and argue that this is part of history and this is part of culture already tells you that we do not have universities for Africa, but we have universities in Africa. And I think it is this particular cry that anywhere in this land, nothing seems to resemble us, that seems to create a collective identity amongst those who are oppressed. And I must say this, Chair, as I close, that I don't think it's possible that an African personality can be constructed outside of the confines of struggle, because it is struggle that constantly reshapes and makes us do away with certain behaviors, characters, feelings, and positions us to have a particular interest of the African people at large. And this is, of course, can be demonstrated even within the so-called definition of the so-called Pan-Africanist Congress, when it says there's a difference between Africans, those who cannot trace themselves anywhere else besides Africa, and Africanists, that is those who live through the liberation or dedicate themselves to the total liberation and combating all forms of social ills that has confronted the African people. So we need to stop being Africans, just mere people who cannot trace themselves anywhere outside of Africa, but start to being Africanists, that had our interest, our character, our attitude must be blended towards the attitude of liberation, the attitude of freedom, the attitude of creating an alternative world, even if we are still in bondages. And I think if only we can sort of construct that particular personality that says no to oppression, we are able to arrive at what students for many years who have succumbed to the commodification of education and all of these things decide by one day that they can no longer stand the increase of fees, they cannot stand the fact that education is still being sold at the highest price. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you to the panelists and also for trying to unpack the African personality. And unfortunately, we have less time, and there will be there's a session that will be going on at 6 o'clock. But I would like to invite all the viewers tomorrow. We'll be looking at the biography of Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, and would like to thank all the panelists for the session that we had today and unpacking some of these questions. These sessions are saved. People can look at them and they can continue to ask questions and also deliberate on them. Thank you to Babu Xaba. Thank you to Masixole, and thank you to Sister Mohau Pheko. And we really apologize for the connection, and to everyone that was attending. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to you, moderator. Thank you.